You've said the Lord's Prayer hundreds of times, maybe thousands. You know it by heart. You could say it half asleep. You probably have. But here's what no one told you. The version you memorized is missing a sentence, not a word, not a phrase, a complete final sentence that Jesus spoke, that the earliest manuscripts preserved, and that was quietly removed sometime in the 4th century by people who understood exactly what it did. That sentence wasn't decoration. It was the exit. A specific declaration that, according to the Gnostic texts Jesus used with his inner circle, broke the frequency hold of the Archons and cleared the field for the prayer to actually land. Speak it without that sentence, and you're knocking on a door. Speak it with that sentence, and the door opens. In the next 20 minutes, you're going to learn what that sentence was, why it was removed, and what happens when you add it back. But first, I need to show you a manuscript that almost no one has read. This was one of the first things I went deep on for awakened minds, because once I found it, I couldn't unfind it, and I've been sitting on the full picture until I could put it together properly. You were taught that the Lord's Prayer ends with "Deliver us from evil," or, depending on your tradition, "Deliver us from the evil one." And then, silence. Amen. That's where you were told it stops. Some traditions add a doxology, "For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory." But most scholars and theologians openly acknowledge that line was added centuries later. It's not in the oldest Greek manuscripts of Matthew. It's not in Luke's version at all. So the prayer ends, and you move on. But here's what creates a problem. The Lord's Prayer, as preserved in Matthew 6, is structured as a complete ascending sequence. It moves from earth to heaven, from the material to the spiritual, from human need to divine alignment. And structurally, if you understand how Jesus taught, a sequence like that doesn't end with a petition. It ends with a declaration. Every piece of Jewish liturgical prayer in the Second Temple tradition ended with a declarative closing, what rabbinical scholars call the chatima, the seal, the closing that confirms the prayer's completion and establishes its effect. The Lord's Prayer, as you received it, has no chatima. It trails off into a request, "Deliver us from evil," with no closing seal. That's not how Jesus prayed. That's not how Jews of his time prayed. That's not how any first-century spiritual practitioner would have structured a teaching prayer. Something is missing, and we know what it is. In 1896, a German scholar named Karl Reinhardt purchased a papyrus codex in Cairo that had been sitting in a private collection for decades. It became known as the Berlin Gnostic Codex, or Codex Berlinensis 8502. Among its contents, the Gospel of Mary and a text called the Sophia of Jesus Christ. In the Sophia of Jesus Christ, there is a passage describing Jesus instructing his disciples on the completion of prayer, including a specific closing declaration to be spoken after "Deliver us from what holds us." The phrase, translated from the Coptic, reads approximately, "For I am not of this realm, and this realm has no claim on what I am." Read that again. "For I am not of this realm, and this realm has no claim on what I am." That is not a petition. That is not a request. That is a declaration of ontological freedom. And it is precisely the kind of statement that, in Gnostic theology, renders archonic authority null. So why isn't it in your Bible? That question has an answer, and the answer is not comfortable. There is a concept that first-century Gnostic Christians called the living seal. The Mandaean tradition, one of the oldest continuously practiced Gnostic sects, still active today in Iraq and Iran, calls it the closing word of power. The books of Jeux, the Gnostic texts discovered at Nag Hammadi that contain the most detailed practical instructions in the early Christian corpus, describe it as the sentence that tells the Archons who you are. I call it the Declaration of Origin. Here's the core principle. Archons, as Jesus described them in the secret book of John, derive their influence from a specific kind of confusion. The confusion of identity. When you don't know, really know, at the level of direct experience, what you are at the most essential level, you are legible to archonic interference. You can be moved, destabilized, redirected. But when you speak a declaration that anchors your identity at the source level, not "I am a good person" or "I am a child of God" in the abstract, but a direct statement that you originate from outside the archonic realm of influence, the interference has nothing to hold. It's not magic. It's not metaphor. It's the equivalent of showing your passport at a border. The Archons are governors of a domain, a declaration of origin that places you outside their domain, removes their jurisdiction. And the Lord's Prayer, in its complete original form, was structured to do exactly this. It begins with relationship, Our Father. It moves through alignment, Your kingdom come, Your will be done. It addresses need, Give us this day our daily bread. It handles debt, Forgive us our trespasses. It requests protection, Deliver us from what holds us. And then, in the version Jesus actually taught, it closes with origin. For I am not of this realm, and this realm has no claim on what I am. Each step prepares the next. The declaration of origin only works after the preceding steps have been completed, because the prayer itself is the preparation for the declaration. Remove the final sentence, and you have a prayer that approaches God, but never fully arrives. Add it back, and the circuit closes. I'm going to prove this to you with manuscripts, with neuroscience, and with a pattern so consistent across traditions that coincidence stops being a credible explanation. Let's start with what the manuscripts actually say. The Didache, also called the Teaching of the 12 Apostles, is one of the oldest Christian documents outside the New Testament. Most scholars date it to between 50 and 120 AD, possibly earlier. It contains a version of the Lord's Prayer and explicitly instructs early Christians to pray it 3 times a day. But the Didache version differs from the Matthew version in a critical way. It contains a closing instruction, not the doxology added later, but a specific directive about what the practitioner should declare after the final petition. The Greek reads, "Hoti sou estin, he basileia kai, he dynamis kai, he doxa eis tous ionas," but followed by a separate line that most modern translations collapse into the doxology or omit entirely. Patristics scholar Kurt Niederwimmer, who produced the definitive critical commentary on the Didache in 1993, noted that the closing structure of the Didache prayer suggests a more complex original ending than what canonical tradition preserved. He stopped short of specifying what that ending was. The Coptic manuscripts don't stop short. In 2007, a team led by Marvin Meyer at Chapman University published a new critical translation of the Nag Hammadi scriptures, the most comprehensive English edition ever produced. In the commentary on the Sophia of Jesus Christ, Meyer noted that the closing declaration found in that text parallels what appears to be a lost closing formula in the Matthean prayer tradition, and specifically identified it as a declaration of ontological non-belonging to the material realm. Non-belonging to the material realm. In Gnostic cosmology, the material realm is the Archons' domain. A declaration that you don't ultimately belong there is a jurisdictional statement. And here is where it gets interesting from a neuroscience perspective. In 2020, researchers at the University of Toronto published a study on what they called identity anchoring declarations, verbal affirmations structured not as aspirational statements, but as statements of essential nature. The difference, I want to be calm, versus I am at my core not a product of this situation. The second formulation, the ontological declaration, produced dramatically different neural effects. Specifically, it activated the medial prefrontal cortex in a way that disrupted what the researchers called contextual capture, the brain state in which your current environment completely determines your emotional response. Contextual capture is, in neurological terms, exactly what archonic influence looks like in the field of inner experience. The ontological declaration breaks it. In real time. Measurably. The study showed a 58% reduction in contextual capture within 60 seconds of speaking an identity-anchoring declaration aloud. 58%. In 60 seconds. Out loud. I cross-referenced this study with the Gnostic closing formula when it came through Awakened Minds, and I spent 3 weeks sitting with the overlap before I was confident enough to say it publicly. The neuroscience is describing the same mechanism the Gnostic texts are describing. Different languages, same phenomenon. Numbers reach the mind. What reaches deeper is another human being. Sister Benedetta Conti was an Italian Dominican nun who spent 40 years in contemplative practice. She is described by her community as having a piercing quality of presence that people noticed immediately upon meeting her. In a 2018 interview published in the Italian theological journal Vita Consacrata, she was asked how she understood the purpose of prayer. She said, "Most people pray from inside the cage. The prayer itself becomes the bars. The purpose of prayer is not to speak to God from the cage. It is to remember while praying that you were never actually in it." She had no known exposure to Gnostic texts. She arrived at the same principle through 40 years of practice. And then there is this. The Eastern Orthodox tradition, specifically the Hesychast school of contemplative prayer associated with Gregory Palamas and the monks of Mount Athos, maintains a practice called the apophatic seal. After any structured prayer sequence, the practitioner speaks a closing declaration of what they are not, a via negativa statement of identity that strips away all conditional, contextual identity and asserts only the most essential nature. The most common form used privately, according to Orthodox contemplative manuals, translates roughly as, "I am not what this world calls me. I am what was before this world named me." Compare that to the Gnostic closing formula, "I am not of this realm, and this realm has no claim on what I am." 2 traditions, 2,000 years, 1 sentence. That is not coincidence. That is the fingerprint of something that actually works. So why did the institution that controls the most widely used prayer in Christian history quietly remove it? Follow the logic. To understand the removal, you need to understand what the Declaration of Origin does to institutional authority. A practitioner who closes their prayer with, "I am not of this realm, and this realm has no claim on what I am," is a practitioner who has just declared, out loud, in the most sacred context of their life, that their ultimate identity is not subject to any earthly jurisdiction, not the church's jurisdiction, not the state's jurisdiction, not the social order's jurisdiction. That's not subversion, it's theology, but it has the same practical effect as subversion, because it produces people who are very difficult to spiritually manage. The Roman Empire needed manageable Christians. Constantine's church, formed in partnership with the Roman state at Nicaea in 325 AD, needed a Christianity that supported social order, not one that produced individuals walking around with an internal declaration of non-jurisdictional status. The Declaration of Origin had to go, and with it went the entire Gnostic framework that made it meaningful. The understanding of Archons, the cosmology of nested realms, the practical tools for navigating spiritual interference. All of it replaced with a simpler system. You are a sinner. The church mediates your forgiveness. You owe obedience to the institution that holds the keys. That system generates the $170 billion a year the Catholic Church earns in the United States alone. It generates the $280 billion global mental health industry that has largely absorbed spiritual distress and renamed it as pathology, treatable by professionals, not resolvable by individuals with tools. It generates the $4.5 trillion wellness and spiritual guidance market that sells you proximity to experiences your tradition was originally designed to give you directly. None of that economy functions if you have the Declaration of Origin and understand what it means. So how was the removal accomplished? First, the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD standardized the canonical texts. The Lord's Prayer was fixed in the Matthean form, without the closing declaration. Second, the Gnostic communities that preserved the full form were declared heretical and systematically suppressed over the following century. By 400 AD, public Gnostic practice in the Roman Empire had been effectively eliminated. Third, the theological vocabulary needed to understand the Declaration of Origin, Archons, realms, ontological non-belonging, was coded as heretical language. You couldn't teach the sentence without teaching the framework, and the framework was illegal. 17 centuries later, that architecture is still running. You were handed an incomplete prayer. Not because Jesus taught an incomplete prayer, because the institution that gave you the prayer had a specific interest in what it left out. Now you have the complete version. Here's what to do with it. 3 steps. Nothing to buy, nothing to join, nothing to perform. Just the prayer you already know, plus what was always supposed to come after it. Step 1. Pray the Lord's Prayer as you know it. Don't change a word. Don't restructure it. Every element of the prayer you received is doing real work, building relationship, alignment, provision, forgiveness, protection in that exact sequence. Speak it at your normal pace. Let each line land before you move to the next. If you've been rushing through it your whole life, slow down. The petition sequence is a preparation. Each line is clearing the way for the next. This step alone, done with full attention for the first time, will feel different than any recitation you've done before. Step 2. Speak, deliver us from what holds us, and mean it specifically. The common translation is, deliver us from evil, or deliver us from the evil one. But the original Aramaic, La tahlan lenesyuna ela patsalan min bisha, is closer to, don't let us enter into what traps us, free us from what misaligns us. Before you add the declaration of origin, spend 5 seconds on this line. Think of one specific thing that has been holding you, a recurring thought pattern, a fear that keeps resurfacing, a dynamic in your life that pulls you away from who you know yourself to be. Name it internally. Hold it in the petition. The declaration that follows works most powerfully when it's responding to something specific, not abstract. Step 3. Speak the declaration of origin out loud. After deliver us from what holds us, pause. 2 full seconds. Then say, clearly, in a normal speaking voice, "For I am not of this realm, and this realm has no claim on what I am." That's it. That is the sentence that was removed. Say it like you mean it, not like you're performing it, not like you're hoping it's true, but like you're stating something you already know. Because that is exactly what it is. It's not an aspiration. It's a reminder. A declaration of what was always the case, spoken into the space where the prayer has just been opened. The books of Jeux describe this moment as the seal closing the vessel, the final element that completes the structure and prevents what was opened from being immediately flooded by interference. Why does this work neurologically? Because the declaration shifts your default mode network from identification with the current context to identification with a frame that transcends the current context. In plain language, it reminds your nervous system that you are not your circumstances, and that reminder, spoken at the moment of maximum spiritual openness, right after the prayer sequence, has the deepest effect. 2 errors that will undermine this practice. Error 1. Saying the declaration quietly or in your head. The original instructions across every tradition that preserves this practice, the Gnostic texts, the Hesychast manuals, the Mandaean closing prayers, all specify voiced declaration. Out loud. The vibration matters. The externalization of the statement matters. Speak it. Error 2. Treating this as a formula that works mechanically, regardless of preparation. The declaration is the seal on the prayer sequence. It depends on what precedes it. If you rush the Lord's Prayer and then tack the declaration on at the end, you'll feel nothing. The sequence is the preparation. The declaration is the culmination. Do the sequence completely, and the declaration lands differently than any prayer you have said in your life. What to expect? The first time, probably nothing dramatic. A slight shift in stillness afterward. A quality of completion that the prayer didn't have before. After 1 week of consistent practice, a noticeable difference in what happens to the prayer in the hours that follow. A quality of protection that's hard to describe but easy to notice. Specifically, the absence of the usual archonic friction. The intrusive thoughts, the ungrounded anxiety, the sense that something external is pulling at you. With sustained practice, a gradually deepening experience of what the prayer was always intended to produce. Not comfort, not hope, but clarity. The feeling of standing on ground that doesn't move. This is not a new practice. This is the oldest version of the practice you already know. You were just given an edited copy. Let's close the loop. You came in knowing the Lord's Prayer by heart. You leave knowing that the version you memorized is missing its final sentence, a declaration of origin that Jesus included, the earliest manuscripts preserved, and 4th century institutional editors removed for reasons that had nothing to do with your spiritual well-being. You saw the evidence. the Didash's structural anomaly, Marvin Meyer's identification of the lost closing formula, the University of Toronto's 58% reduction in contextual capture through ontological declaration, Sister Benedetta Conti arriving at the same principle through 40 years of practice, and the Eastern Orthodox Hesychast tradition preserving the same sentence under a different name for 2,000 years. You understood who benefits from the incomplete version, and the three mechanisms that kept it incomplete for 17 centuries. And you now have the complete prayer, everything you already know, plus, for I am not of this realm, and this realm has no claim on what I am. In 20 minutes, you learned what it took 2,000 years to bury and another 80 years of manuscript scholarship to recover. You are not the same person who clicked on this video. You are now someone who prays the complete prayer. And the difference between the incomplete version and the complete version is not small. There's more. The Aramaic reconstruction of the full original prayer, the relationship between the Declaration of Origin and the 5 seals described in the books of Jeux, and what the Pistis Sophia says happens to archonic influence when this declaration is spoken in the context of community, not just individually. Leave a comment if you want that. If this gave you something, if it filled in a gap you felt for a long time without knowing what the gap was, leave a like. It costs you nothing. It puts this in front of the people who are still praying an incomplete prayer and don't know why it feels like something's missing. Subscribe, because what's coming next takes this further than I've taken anything on this channel. You were given an edited prayer. Now you have the original. See you in the next one.